Okay, since the speaker is here, I think we're going to wrap this up, but I would just like to say on my own behalf that I appreciate the fact that you came out and expressed your views. You abided by what I asked you to abide by, which was to keep it to 1 minute, and you were polite and respectful. And I think this was a wonderful exercise, not only in hearing different points of view, but public speaking. I think for those of you that came up here, this is a public speaking experience that you couldn't get in a speech class. So I think that's good. I would also like to take a moment to say why I'm here. And I'm associated with the Traditional Values Club. So my comments are probably going to be a little different than what you just heard. I'm here sort of out of, first I want to say though, that I agree with probably 90% of what I heard today. I agree that we don't judge people. I think we can judge actions. We have to make judgments about actions because we have to decide what actions we're going to perform ourselves and which ones we're not going to perform. But we don't judge people. And I think that's an important distinction that we often fail to make. But I'm here sort of out of self-defense, in a sense, because as I look around, I see that there are many attacks against freedom of religion and freedom of conscience going on in this country. I could name a number of them. We have Catholic adoption agencies that have been forced to close their doors after 100 years of doing good work because they will not place a child with a gay couple against their conscience, against their religious beliefs. So they're held for hundreds of years. There have been many photographers, bakers, other people associated with the wedding industry that are being forced out of the opportunity to earn a living. They're being forced out of their jobs because they don't want to cooperate with something they don't agree with. We are free to have different views about what we believe in and what we don't believe in. But when a person is forced out of his livelihood because he doesn't want to bake a cake for a gay wedding, I don't think that's fair. Because I think that person should have a right to follow their conscience and follow their religion. I'll make the distinction between a business that refuses to serve people because of who they are. I don't think that should be permitted. I don't think we should be permitted to refuse to serve someone because they're gay and we disagree with their beliefs. But I think we should be free to refuse to participate in an activity that we don't agree with. And when a band, let's say, was forced by rule of law to play at a gay wedding, they're being forced to give their assent, give their approval, celebrate with something that they disagree with. And I think they should be free in freedom of conscience and freedom of religion to not be forced by law to do that. And that's what I see happening in this country, and I'm afraid of it. Okay, with that, I'm going to turn this over to Bonnie, who's going to introduce our speaker. As I said, I hope that you will give him respect, listen to what he has to say, and then afterwards maybe we can talk more about his views and reviews.
He's debated with top homosexual advocates while appearing on hundreds of TV, radio, and news programs, including Fox's Andy, he's been quoted on homosexuality, which is in newspapers across the nation. He will address the health issues associated with homosexual behaviors and the question of whether same-sex attraction is a condition or disorder. We heard Will assert that people are warning as though the science is conclusive. Well, that was an assertion. We filtered something as So, and yet, you know, it's nice to be away from others say and make them be true, because we wish that would be really wonderful. And everybody would like to do that. But anyway, I won't bother you anymore. We'll let Peter Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for your patience. As I was zooming down the highway speeding, there was a big traffic jam in Minneapolis, and so that's part of the reason I'm late, but I pondered about the ethics of asking God to help me cheat on the highway. And so I didn't really pray, but I was hoping not to get busted by the cops, and ultimately I settled behind a guy in a midlife crisis in a Maserati or something, hoping that if anybody got ticketed, it would be him. But thank you so much for coming, and thank you for exhibiting what I consider true tolerance and true diversity. To me, and I think to a lot of people, diversity represents the respectful airing of views, something we don't see enough on this issue. And I would say that comes from both sides. You've got Fred Phelps on the right, because he just passed away with his preposterous God hates fags message. And on the left, you've got people who think they have the right to supersede other people's faith. And I also think that there's a sort of a new definition of tolerance, which you guys are not exhibiting here. Tolerance used to mean I could sit down the day after this, somebody polar opposite my views, we could have a cup of coffee and have a lively exchange, not be at each other's throats. And I'm afraid the new definition of tolerance, and I think it's mainly purported pushed by the left, is sort of, there are certain views that are by definition intolerant. And those views do not deserve to be heard in the public square. They certainly don't deserve to be aired on the media. And with respect to this issue, I think there are many on the left who say there's only one legitimate viewpoint on this issue. And I don't believe that's true tolerance. And I think there's a rise, sort of a pushback now, people saying no, our views. Well, this is what I say, not even really willing to hear the other side. I think this is regretful. Your message was effing garbage that day, so this is a shame. But well, those of you who remain are exhibiting true tolerance. Wait a minute. I mean, this is the left in action. I'm sorry. You know, tolerance for me, but not for you. Don't even want to hear a viewpoint. But that's their right, and I just think it's immature. You know, if you can't even hear the other person's ideas, how can you fairly characterize them? They would stipulate that I'm hateful without knowing me, just by knowing my ideology, what I believe. And that is, I think that's the left's error. They would purport to define for everybody what constitutes hate. And they would purport also to be able to say which views should be heard and which views shouldn't be heard. They want to decide for everybody. And I'm experiencing this personally myself. I'm going to Canada tomorrow and speaking at a pro-life group meeting at the Saskatchewan Pro-Life Association. And a group, actually they weren't, the couple that started it weren't gay. They're a liberal couple. And they formed a group. First they tried to get me kicked off the speakers list. I was invited to speak. And then after that, they're actually petitioning the government of Canada to have me turned away at the border. And the name of this group is Intolerance-Free Weyburn. Weyburn's a small town in Saskatchewan. So the Intolerance-Free group is so intolerant that they can't even let a private group decide who is going to be its speaker. And they would have themselves be the arbiters of who gets to be heard and who doesn't get to be heard in their town. And I think we're seeing that sort of on a grand scale in this debate. Some homosexual activist groups like GLAAD, used to be called the Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation, now they just go by the acronym GLAAD. They work night and day to keep people like me from being even brought onto a TV program to be interviewed. And constantly mischaracterizing, and I had it later in my notes. I gotta tell you, I wasn't prepared for the walkout, but at least we have a more intimate gathering here. It's funny that they heard themselves speak, but then they wouldn't hear the opponent. So that, to me, that says a lot. And I certainly tell my children, here, go, read your opponent's views. I've been reading gay newspapers for 20 years. I'm practically one of the most loyal subscribers to the Washington Blade. I mean, if you can't even read the other side and listen to the other side, then you're really not engaged in a civic and respectful debate or discussion. And I would, the same, if there's people on our side who actually really do hate people, if they really hate people practicing homosexuality, then that's shame on them. I'm a Christian, I can't hate anybody. We disagree with behaviors, but disagreement does not constitute hate. It doesn't constitute bigotry to defend your moral views. That's not bigotry. That's merely standing up for what you believe in. But we face a systematic effort to redefine words, and I think it's regretful that this debate often devolves into this sort of jingoistic and walkouts and the like. There are plenty of venues where homosexual activists are expressing themselves. I think all of us could agree on that. So what's the problem with somebody on the other side making their views known? As I said, I think this is one of the most fascinating debates. I think it goes well beyond the homosexual issue. I think it's really, and I think Bonnie would agree with me. And thank you, Bonnie and Vicki, for setting this up. Where's Vicki? Vicki, okay. Very good of you to do this, and I'm so sorry for being late. But I think this debate really now it's beyond just a homosexual issue. I think it's really about worldviews. And I think one side, or maybe there are more than two sides, but the side I'm on, I stand for, I'm a Christian. I believe what I believe, not just because it's what is revealed in the Bible and Judeo-Christian teachings through the centuries, also through reason, the study of nature. But I think that we're now seeing in this LGBT debate sort of one side recognizes that there are appropriate boundaries for man. They're supernatural boundaries. But even for people who don't believe in God, there are boundaries. And on the other side, I think it's more of a subjective, whatever I decide truth to be, we hear that expression, my truth. You have your truth, I have my truth. Well, the problem is, if you believe in absolute truth, it's not always compatible with a million different truths. But we now see the transgender movement. I'm sure most of you saw the Facebook story with 56 different genders. You've got pansexuality. You've got plenty of immorality on the so-called straight side. We're seeing straights increasingly practice what used to be regarded as deviant behaviors that we used to criticize homosexuals for. So, for example, anal sex is rising. More and more straight couples, and I use that term advisedly, straight couples, practicing anal sex, and I believe there are health repercussions for that. And so it's not fair to say, the reason marriage is declining is solely because of homosexual activists. Of course not. Marriage has been in decline for a number of years, disrespected by men and women who don't take it seriously. And I've been married for 25 years. My wife's put up with me for that long. But I do think we need to return to the ethic of encouraging people to save sex for marriage, which is almost as politically incorrect as to say you're opposed to homosexuality. Save sex for marriage and live in a lifetime commitment for marriage. And let's face it, there's a lot of straight immorality that people don't talk about as much as this agenda because it's so divisive and there's a big focus on it. But you can't even go to a movie sometimes anymore without seeing some of the most vulgar, attempted humor, and just really crass stuff that you couldn't imagine being in American movies, say even maybe 20 years ago. The level of debauchery and such. And so this does not occur in a vacuum, of course. I believe this is all a product of the sexual revolution, which sort of led to the erosion of what I consider healthy boundaries. A lot of the attacks against my particular group and a number of pro-family groups like Family Research Council is that we are hateful. And I think this is sort of a calculated campaign by homosexual activists. You have, as I said, the group GLAD, which works on the media, trying to block opposing views in the media on the basis that they're homophobic and hateful. And I don't believe that term homophobic is really a meaningful word, because it encompasses all sorts of things to different people. I don't fear homosexuals. I don't have an irrational fear. I simply disagree with what I consider that to be an immoral lifestyle. But then you've got the Southern Poverty Law Center. How many of you have heard of the Southern Poverty Law Center? They did a lot of good work in the past against racism, against the Klan, against these evil groups. Now, in the last few years, they've expanded, and they're really condemning groups which have a moral opposition to homosexuality. And they're labeling us hate groups. Well, then what happens is, and I believe that SPLC has a very radical far-left agenda, but then what happens is, people start repeating this charge, and they say, well, you're a certified hate group, and this is just sort of politics in action, and I don't believe it's actually fair. But, for example, with this group in Canada, which is trying to keep me out of Canada, they said, well, he's a member of a hate group. And these things are repeated often, over and over, and a lot of people simply aren't, they don't know how to answer these charges. And a lot of people don't pay that much attention to these things, and so sort of these polemics get repeated over and over again. As I said, disagreement does not equal hate, and tolerance has been redefined. Oh, okay. Oh, here's this way or this way? Oh, okay. The way I see homosexuality is, it's not really about who you are, it's about what you do. It's a behavior. And behaviors are changeable. And I have a tract to pass out, I think some of you got it, from an ex-gay named Steve Bennett. There are people who, it's politically incorrect to say so. Steve Bennett was once in the homosexual lifestyle for many years, and then he got witnessed to by his friend who brought him the Bible and said, you have to read this. And long story turned short, he has 2 children, he lives with his beautiful wife, and he's been out of the lifestyle for a number of years. And so I believe homosexuality is something that people can go into and they can go out of. Anybody heard of Shirlene McRae? She's the wife of the new socialist mayor of New York. And she was once self-identified as a lesbian, and she fell in love with de Blasio, I think his name is, the new mayor of New York. So she changed her behavior. So I think we often hear, and it's troubling when I hear very young people say this, but it's who I am. And I think that is sort of a self-serving way to think of it, because we see all sorts of behaviors changing all the time. We see people going in and out of homosexuality. We see people come out as bisexual, and they identify as gay. We see people go from bisexual to straight. I was just reading a case. And we do see a number of ex-lesbians, former gay men. I have a friend named Walt Heyer, who's a former transgender. It's an amazing story. He actually went through the body disfiguring operation, and he was befriended by faithful Christians. He now urges men to not go through that operation. And I think what happens is, and I would consider a lot of the debate on this influenced heavily by sort of a propagandistic treatment of this issue. And by that I mean that the media is so heavily weighted to one side, so heavily in favor of the gay side, that there's really not a fair debate media-wise. And that's why groups like this one exist, to sort of try to right the balance. But we don't hear much in the media about ex-gays. I have a good friend named Linda Jernigan. She's an African-American, former lesbian. She was in the lifestyle, I think, 11 or 13 years. She's now been out of the lifestyle for, I think, over a decade. She said when she first came out of the lifestyle, they said, oh, you're just changing your behavior. Now they don't say that anymore. She left the lifestyle. But, you know, Linda Jernigan never got on the Oprah show. You know, she was right there in Chicago. She'd have been the perfect guest for Oprah. But she wasn't the right ideology, the right belief. And there's a lot of media bias on this, and it doesn't serve anybody. I think a fair debate is something we can all handle. And another thing I think that's not talked about, for example.
Did she try to get on there and was turned down?
Yeah, I mean, we made note, in fact, we even called Oprah show, and she's right there in Chicago. And I don't think Oprah ever, I think she actually did occasionally, once do a show on X Gays, but the point I'm making is Oprah did many shows and increasingly was pro-gay throughout her career towards the end, where she's a very strong advocate of same-sex marriage, so-called. I'm going to put that caveat because I don't believe that's truly marriage. And you rarely see ex-gays getting fair treatment in the media. Another thing you don't hear talk about, I bring up the case of Walt Hyatt, the former transgender, transsexual. There are circumstances in people's lives which you can see affecting their choices, their sexual identity choices, their sexual behavior choices. In Walt's case, he had a kind of a semi-abusive father who was a little over the top in his discipline. And when he went to his grandmother's house, his grandmother would put him on a little stool. This is when he was like 5 years old, very young. Would put him on a stool and dress him in a purple chiffon dress. So I guess she wanted a granddaughter, not a grandson. Now, is it common sense to assume that that had a profound effect on Walt's life as he grew older? He became a very successful professional, but he had these ideas, he had this alternative female identity in his head. And so I think we're more honest if we say that the behavioral choices that people make are linked, not every time, but I think there are many ways into homosexuality and many ways out. I don't think there's one way in, I don't think there's one certain way. But I think that we have instances like this. And I'll give you another example. Anybody familiar with Don Lemon on CNN, anchor? He's an anchor on CNN, and I read his book, and when he was very young, first of all, his mother was having an adulterous affair with her boss, and she would often stay there, I guess, because of the need to have time together, and sort of, he would allow that they would stay at the office, and I guess that was his way of, sort of doing this. And so, and the second thing is, Don Lemon, who's now a very successful anchor at CNN, and who self-identifies as gay, and celebrates it, he was molested by an older teen boy when he was very young. And apparently this boy molested a number of boys in the neighborhood. Now, the rigid sort of, I'll call it, LGBT ideological way to look at this is take the idea of his gay identity and don't work backward and say this is who he is. Most likely, they don't always say they're born that way, but a lot of times that's the presumption that they're born this way. This is really inherently who they are. But I think in a case like that, it's much more sensible to say that if a child experiences molestation or predation at a very young age, and he has a deviant sexual pole, male-on-male homosexuality, when he's that young, that also will have a very prominent effect on his life choices. It will influence him. And there's other cases. I believe Melissa Etheridge was an out lesbian, was molested, and there are many, many cases like this. In fact, the woman I mentioned, Linda Jernigan, she was actually seduced by an older woman, who basically seduced her when she was a minor, which is actually a crime. And I think this is another thing that's not talked about in the media. Sort of what's often happens is there are celebrated coming out stories. That's the latest thing. Every coming out is something to celebrate in the media. And I don't think we really get a fair treatment of why people make the choices they do. And so I do believe that the issue is about behavior. It's a moral issue. And I don't believe anybody is defined by their behavior. There are people who practice pornography, who are addicted to pornography. There are people involved in all sorts of sexual sin. But we don't normally call them or identify them by their sin. I don't know if anybody who's ever been called an adultery phobe. But I suspect probably most of us here, if you follow the logic of homophobe, would also be adultery phobes, and I hope most of you are also pornophobes. The point is, we don't define people by their sexual behavior. And that leads me to what I call the sexual sin substitution test. I say if you have question. Now, this applies to me as a Christian. I don't know what belief system you are, but if you adhere to the Judeo-Christian historic sensibility and moral teaching on homosexuality, I think this applies. Whenever you're hearing the issue of homosexuality debated, substitute another sexual sin and see if it makes sense. We don't have adultery pride parades, right? We do have homosexual pride parades, gay pride. We don't have President Obama declaring every June to be porn users' pride month. And yet we have gay pride month. And I know this is sort of against what you usually hear the issue discussed, but the reason I do this is because I believe that the terminology has been greatly affected, and whoever controls the semantics, whoever controls the terms, controls the debate. Now, apply my method versus the method of gay. I think that word is problematic because when you say I'm gay, it sounds like an essential trait. Perhaps a condition, but more like a trait. I'm black, I'm Hispanic, I'm gay. As opposed to someone who is practicing homosexual behavior, involved in the homosexual lifestyle, something that suggests behavior. Now, it's interesting to me that the gay side doesn't like to acknowledge the ex-gay side. So to me that's curious, because if you're going to accept somebody's self-definition of gay, why don't they accept and respect people who say they're ex-gay, who left the lifestyle? Sure.
Can you give an example of how somebody who is homosexual has mistreated or has not accepted somebody who lived the lifestyle at one point and then
The question is, if I get this right, is an example of somebody who's been mistreated as sort of an ex-gay?
Yes.
Yes, I think there are plenty of examples. There is a fellow named Wayne Besson who's now moved to Chicago. He formed a group called Truth Wins Out. He's very hostile and demeaning, not just to pro-family activists like myself, but also to ex-gays. There are constantly, ex-gays are constantly being told that that's not who they really are. The example is given that I'm a right-handed person. I could teach myself to write left-handed if I really worked hard. You know, I could even sign my name, you know. And so it's not accepting their story. That presumes that the essential inherent nature of that person was gay, and they're sort of breaking away from their natural person. That's sort of the idea, I think, that the homosexuals have. Not all homosexuals. Of course, there's no overarching homosexual. There are homosexualities, very many behaviors, and there are different activists. There are activists. Just this morning I read an activist, a newsletter from a sort of a libertarian homosexual group, which was bemoaning the gay activists on his own side, the gay side, who are sort of intolerant of Christians and others who don't want to honor, you know, the photographer case we just saw, not taken by the Supreme Court, of the Christian photographers who politely declined to use their business to be part of a homosexual lesbian commitment ceremony. They said we can't honor that. And there are gay activists who oppose, gay advocates, homosexual people who oppose aspects or even the entirety of the homosexual activist agenda. And in fact, one of the people who supported my right to speak in Canada, I just met him, a guy in the UK, who's come out and said, yeah, I think you're being mistreated. So we don't want to generalize, of course. But I think there is maybe a tad growing respect for the ex-gays because they haven't gone away, but there's a lot of mistreatment, a lot of demonization of these people, and also a sort of a lack of acknowledging their story. And I think of the biggest thing is they don't get the media time. Now, even Fox News, gives very little time, if any, to ex-gays. I find that curious because Fox News, they're sort of right now, I saw Sean Hannity. I watch Fox News a lot. Surprise, surprise. Sean Hannity is having black conservatives on. And I think it's a good thing he's doing because there are a lot of great black conservatives which don't get much respect in the media. And some brilliant people like Thomas Sowell and Walter Williams are just the most amazing, some really fine intellectual scholars and activists. But Sean Hannity, to my knowledge, has rarely, if ever, had on somebody who's ex-gay. And I think that's interesting to me because I think it's a very interesting story. People who kind of go against the culture, which I believe, as a Christian, you're not supposed to run with the culture. you're supposed to be willing to endure persecution if necessary to stay faithful to the gospel.
My name is Tom Strobar. I'm on the board of directors of Parents and Friends of Ex-Gays and Gays. And our ex-president is Greg Quinlan, who happens to be from Dayton, Ohio, who worked for the Human Rights Campaign before he saw over 100 of his friends die from AIDS. As he said, in his life, he never experienced the kind of hate as a gay person, as an openly gay person, as he has since he's declared himself ex-gay.
Yeah, I'll repeat that. Greg Quinlan is a friend of mine as well, and hello Tom, does great work, Tom Strobar. Greg Quinlan said he never has experienced near the persecution when he was living as a gay man as he does now as an ex-gay man. Greg does fine work, and he's experienced some direct harassment at the hands of this Wayne Besson, who's a very vicious homosexual activist who runs a group called, ironically, Truth Wins Out. But I was touching on, sure.
I understand you're touching on, but one thing I wanted to comment on is I did want to know your view on the fact that over 50% of men and women who go to conversion camps end up killing themselves either at the camp or later in life.
Well, I can't verify that statistic, and it doesn't sound right to me. I think conversion camps is a misnomer because let me say something about conversion camps. In the testimony, there are a lot of distortions. I think people they exercise their own self-determination to go to places where there is ex-gay therapy. In the debate over New Jersey, where they banned so-called reparative therapy, which gay activists often call conversion therapy, they banned it for minors. One of the testifiers, Pearson, who actually testified before the legislature in New Jersey, was a transgender man who said that, I believe, and I'm going to characterize this, I may have some facts wrong, but he went to a conversion camp and he experienced this awful beatings and cruelty at this Christian conversion camp in Ohio. Well, it turns out Christopher Doyle, who himself is ex-gay, runs a group called Voice for the Voiceless, they started digging, and it turns out this story was completely fallacious. In fact, this man who testified in New Jersey lifted the entire story from a RuPaul reality show. RuPaul is a transgender guy, he's got a show, and that whole story was and yet, it was a complete fabrication, and that was, let me finish. Not a lot of I think I saw an AP which reported that tale as news. Governor Christie signed that legislation which effectively bans reparative therapy, pro-heterosexual sort of change therapy for minors, and it was that should have been retracted, that entire testimony.
Just to correct what you just said, RuPaul is not a transgender person, he's a drag queen in an art form.
Right,
So.
okay. RuPaul, correction, RuPaul, drag queen is an art form. But the story was lifted right from that reality show, and I would stipulate that if a conservative did that, something so out of bounds as to rip off a lie from a movie or a show, rightly they would be taken to task. Sure.
I would also like to make a correction on what you said. The story itself is not fallacious. The person did lift it, but it was actually the life story of one of the contestants on the reality show. And it's a proven story. That person did endure very hard times at the hands of.
According to Christopher Doyle, and I guess we'll have to settle this, and I'd be happy to get your info, we could go back and forth, but Chris Doyle said that they were not able to locate the so-called Christian camp affiliated with, I think it was a church. They were not able to locate the church. They didn't find it. So I'm not sure if I agree with that statement. But I'm happy to give my information out. You can send it to me. But
I'm not saying that this Christian camp.
No, I understand. I
I'm
understand.
saying that if you would let me talk for a second, that the fact is that this is a person's life story. It happened in another state, not in Ohio. It's the fact that this stuff does happen.
Okay.
You're acting like it doesn't.
I'll grant you that there have been abuses. I mean, there used to be a sort of a, it doesn't happen anymore. There was a forced therapy, electric shock therapy, and there were abuses in the past. But, we'll get to the bottom of what you're talking about. But the testimony, as was in the New Jersey, was about an Ohio incident. So even if what you say is true, the testimony was not true. And that's, I mean, that's what we're getting at here. I think there's a lot of claims that are made. We see Christians being blamed for tragedies that occur. Say a minor commits suicide. A lot of times people of faith are blamed for these awful incidents. And I think we have to be very careful, you know, in just sort of assuming that one side, what they're claiming is true. Sure.
Do you have a specific example where someone was claiming that the Christian side was causing young people to commit suicide? Or
Oh, we've heard these claims all the time. I've been accused of causing suicides almost on a daily basis.
I know, but do you have a specific example in which someone actually hurt themselves?
Oh, there have been young people who've killed themselves. But even people who are I wouldn't call conservatives, have argued that you can't simply say this is the fault of the religious right. That's what I'm getting at. These are complex incidents. I think some of these tragedies are even copycats. You've seen you know, such incredible attention given to some of these cases. I think it's unfortunate that they can lead to copycat, you know, suicides and such. But these are very, these are, you know, there's a multiplicity of factors in this, and it doesn't help anybody to say these are blamed for on people of faith. I'll give you a historical example. The Matthew Shepard case. Is anybody familiar with that? When I was working in Washington D.C. for, I think, the Family Research Council at the time when that happened, and the homosexual activist groups blackened their websites and said that Matthew Shepard died because of the actions of the religious right. Well, it turns out it was a far more complicated thing than that. There's a book out now by a gay author who says that he was not killed, quote unquote, because he was gay. So I think there's a simplistic line here. And I'm not saying that gay activists are the only one to put out simplistic lines. I'm saying these are complex issues.
Thank you for taking my second question. Can you agree with the statement that homosexuality being so popular in the news right now might be because it had such a negative connotation to it in the past, and people are more accepting of it, and that might be why it is so popular in the news right now?
Well, yeah, but I think there's all sorts of results from it being so popular and so talked about.
I'm just asking if you agree with that statement that it might be because of that.
I think, yeah, I think definitely. I think, as Greg Quinlan, I think, told me that when he came out, I think he was in his college age, it was more towards college. Now it's happening much younger. But I think there's just a lot of misinformation out there. For example, Gallup did a poll, I think it was 2011, and they found that the average American, the mean average for Americans, when asked how many people in society are gay, said 25%. And I think the number's between 1 and 4%. So there's a lot of, you know, the media is, I think, with Hollywood, is creating the impression that this is far bigger than it is, and it also certainly it influences people, just like I believe violence can have an influence on young people. But again, coming back to the ex-gay angle, when will we see a healthy, content ex-gay in the movies? We've all seen movies. I've seen so many movies who have sort of the obligatory gay character. Sometimes there's awful portrayals. Like there's one. Does anybody remember the name of the movie with what was in Suburbia? And it was American Beauty, I think. And in that movie, the sergeant, the military guy who was the most, quote, homophobic, turns out to be planting a kiss on Kevin Spacey at the end of the movie. The most normal characters in the movie were the homosexual couple next door. Everybody else was confused, deviant. And we see this over and over again. And I would say if Hollywood was to be honest, they would actually have a movie where it's just somebody who's a former homosexual. He's not the focus of the show, of the movie, but it's a fair treatment, and not a demeaning treatment.
I think the intention was to say that the expectations of the people you meet around you are probably different than who they actually are.
Right.
I don't think it was to portray homosexuals in any positive light. It was to say what you're thinking
Sure.
about one person you might find to be true about other people.
But I'm a little more cynical than you, I guess. Because I think that it was also, there's a message in these, and there's also the reality that GLAAD, which is a very powerful media group, actually gets scripts in advance and advises on how to portray characters. So I think, I mean, that, to me, that movie was almost, you could use it to instruct, you could do a teaching on it as classic propaganda of sort of what used to be considered normal was, you know, sort of portrayed as abnormal, and was what was once considered aberrant is the most normal. And then of course the military guy, the old cliche, and I've been on the receiving end of this a million times. People who speak out or who oppose homosexuality are really secret homosexuals and sort of bitter, twisted, irrational homophobes. And so that was in that movie that was portrayed that way. But let me get on here a little bit. I think I have an article, I'm not sure if it was passed out, on the freedom of conscience. I think this is an interesting time. We've got many, many cases now where we really see the battle between gay rights and religious freedom and freedom of conscience. As I said, we just, my side, just lost, if I could say that, just lost the case in New Mexico. A very interesting case of a Christian couple. They politely refused to involve their business in a lesbian commitment ceremony. They were fined $6,000. The case went to the New Mexico Supreme Court. They lost in a unanimous decision in the New Mexico Supreme Court, and that case was just brought to the U.S. Supreme Court, which they declined to hear the case. So the New Mexico court ruling stands, and the implications are very serious, not just people of faith, but anybody who does business with the public, and that would be virtually every small business, sort of loses their right to say, no, I don't want to involve my business in gay marriage. And I think this is a fascinating debate because you've got gay libertarians on the side of Christians, you've got straight liberals on the side of what I would consider the more radical gay activists. And I think this is going to be probably the main focus of this issue, this debate as it goes forward in the decades that come. I don't think the issue is going away, by the way. I think a lot of times the other side is sort of trying to create, my opponents are trying to create the aura of invincibility, inevitability. We hear all the time gay marriage is destined to be in all 50 states. And I would just caution you because I think, you know, there's ebbs and flows of debates. I remember now it's about, well, I think it's over 15 years ago, when the pro-choice side on the abortion debate was pretty much assuring itself that the life issue, the big cultural battle over abortion was on its way out. Society was settling into a pro-choice mindset, and the pro-life side was going to be relegated to obscurity. And we've seen the exact opposite. On that issue, the pro-life advocates, I believe, have a strong momentum. It's mainly because people have come to see that the unborn child is a human being. If you look at an ultrasound, I happen to have a Down syndrome brother, so I'm very passionately pro-life because Down syndrome babies are often aborted when the mother is told by the doctor that the child has Downs. I think it's something like 90% of those babies are aborted. And so there was a time, I'll get to you in a second.
I would like to see the proof that 90% of Down syndrome babies are aborted.
I hope it's not true, but if you give me your email, I'll be happy to check. That's just what I recall reading.
Just stating the fact.
Yeah, but I'll be happy to check it, and I hope it's less. But it is an occurrence, and my brother has brought great joy, my brother Jimmy, to our family's lives. We couldn't imagine life without him. And so, you know, there was a time when the idea of young people pledging to remain abstinent until marriage was thought ridiculous. And so there's no inevitable outcome of this debate over homosexuality. I believe that the discussion we're seeking to move the discussion more to behavior, less on sort of abstracts like marriage equality, which I regard as another sort of euphemism that the other side uses. I believe it's very easy to demonstrate that homosexual so-called marriages are not equal before God or even just by their nature. For example, 2 men or 2 women cannot produce children by themselves. That's just a fact. And so there's no procreative ability coming from within homosexuality. And that certainly is one reason why homosexual marriage, I don't really believe, is marriage. We use the phrase natural marriage, biblical marriage, but this is sort of a revolutionary development in society when the society attempts to give equal treatment through the law to aberrant behavior, even insofar as defining it as marriage, and treat that in the law the same as marriage between a man and a woman, producing children and family and future generations. Vicki, how much time do I have?
Well, I mean, on the paper we said till 1:30, but you were
Okay.
late, and
All right.
so, I mean, I
Is
don't
2
know.
o'clock okay? I mean, I'll stop soon and we can take more questions.
Okay.
I have to leave at 1:45.
Okay. Then I'll end with this point on the behavior. One of the stories I believe that is rarely told fairly in the media are the health implications of homosexual behavior, especially male homosexual behavior classified as MSM, men who have sex with men. And there are some amazing statistics on this. We don't take any joy in reporting them. We merely believe that these should be a factor in the discussion. For example, here's one statistics reported by the CDC. You can find it. Just Google it on my website. It actually links to the CDC paper. I think it was a 2011 CDC report on HIV in young men. Boys and young men ages 13 to 24 with HIV, 94 to 95% of the HIV cases for males ages 13 to 24 were linked to homosexual sex. 94 to 95%. That's virtually every case of HIV. There's all sorts of statistics, not just on HIV, but all sorts of STDs. For example, anal cancer. Gay men are 80 times as likely to contract anal cancer as the general population. And on it goes. And and I believe that there is a disproportionate link between homosexual sexual behavior and sexually transmitted diseases, which to me again testifies to the reality that nature itself, I believe, discriminates against homosexual behavior. Nature discriminates against homosexual behavior. And there are simply, I don't believe that, for example, HIV is taught accurately to young students. Often we hear it said that anybody can contract HIV, which of course is true. But the incredible percentage of cases that are linked to MSM, men who have sex with men, to the point where even some gay advocates now admit, the saying is HIV is a gay disease, I think testifies to the fact that, or my belief at least, that homosexual behavior is immoral and unnatural. Yeah.
Now, this is more as I want your opinion on this. What's your opinion on the fact that back when interracial marriage used to be a big hot topic and race used to be, it was described that African Americans and others that are not white are the ones that are increasing the rate of HIV when it first started to occur in America?
Well,
I just feel
I thought you were going to ask about the marriage question with regard to people of faith who there were self-purported Christians who said that interracial marriage was immoral. But also Christians, I think, led, or were a big part of the effort to overturn miscegenation laws. Ironically, African-American women, one of the factors for African-American women getting HIV are men on the down low, which would be secretly homosexual men who don't necessarily identify as gay, and engaging in homosexual practices on the side and bringing disease back. But
do you have a statistic for that I could see?
There is a link on my site.
But what is it? What's the link? What's the site that it goes to?
Well, it goes to a study which was not done by religious conservatives or even conservatives, and it was talking about one of the main risk factors is bisexual males, and I think unfortunately the CDC classifies those transmissions in the black community, or just in the down low, they classify that as a heterosexual transmission of HIV. But if the male partner is engaged in secret bisexual, homosexual behavior on the side, I don't believe that, obviously, homosexual aberrant sex had a factor in that transmission. I don't believe it's really accurate to say that, call that a heterosexual transmission. But let me just say something, pegging off your question on the interracial analogy, which is often brought forth on the gay marriage issue. I had a buddy who married a black girl, and I went to the University of Michigan, and they're a beautiful family. But when he went to get married, he was from Gaylord, Michigan. His best friend, who was going to be his best man, didn't show. He just boycotted the wedding. And so my belief is that racism is a sin and homosexual behavior is a sin. I don't believe it's a fair analogy, interracial marriage and so-called same-sex marriage, because interracial marriages, nobody can deny that they produce beautiful children and families. There is nothing inherent about them that is not analogous to a family, a natural family. However, homosexual so-called marriages are obviously lacking a gender, and this is really a revolutionary redefinition of what marriage is. Even if you go to polygamy, polygamy had a male-female component. And I actually believe that polygamy would be, it would be easier to say that polygamy could classify as marriage than homosexuality. And yet, you know, this analogy is brought up frequently, and I'll take you again. Oh, let me take you because you've had less.
My first question is, if a man and woman, a straight relationship, if the woman cannot reproduce, do you think they shouldn't get married as well, or if the man is sterile?
No, absolutely not.
But 2 men also can't reproduce.
Yes.
And 2 women also can't
But
reproduce.
the problem is that and this is an example, it's always brought out, the sterile, the heterosexual couple that cannot produce children. Arguing that is really arguing from the exception. That's not the typical straight couple. There are exceptions, of course, to every rule, but it is a rule to say that homosexual unions cannot produce within themselves. So I think it's a bad analogy. Nobody ever argued that Pat Buchanan's marriage was immoral because Pat Buchanan, a conservative commentator, couldn't have children. So I think that's kind of a diversion. I don't think it's analogous. And I have to say, in Chicago, I was told by a black Christian leader that opposition to homosexual marriage in Chicago among African Americans is a 90% issue, 90% opposed. And I think that the gay community has sort of overplayed its hand with this racial analogy because it's turned a lot of people off. And I think it's not the best politics on their side.
My other question is, don't you think if everyone's allowed to be open, there wouldn't be as much creeping around and down low men, therefore it wouldn't be sexually transmitted to straight people since you are so worried about it?
I don't think that. I don't think that because of the fact you got to understand where these gay men are coming from. No matter how many people like it, you feel me? It's all about how they feel about it. Even though they're going out and they're engaging in the act, don't mean that they actually think that it's right.
Well, they don't think that it's right because they have been directed.
It's a stigma.
But
So it's
regardless of their
Well,
direction,
wait a minute. Let me answer that question.
We
Because
think to hear the speaker.
the way that was framed was, he said they don't believe it's right, and then you said they don't believe that's right because they've been directed to think that way.
Yeah.
I think that's demeaning to people of faith because it almost sounds like I hold my beliefs. Was I directed to believe what I believe? You know, were we guided by some? Do I pick up the red phone to Pat Robertson every morning and say, what am I supposed to say today? You know, people come at their beliefs from a variety of perspectives. Faith informs us, reason informs us. I believe a strong case can be made to what I said, that nature itself discriminates against homosexuality. I think that's it's hard to, and I think it's actually incumbent upon homosexual activists to make the case for the other side. I mean, if homosexuality was treated as aberrant and sinful throughout history, and I could refer you to a good website on the Bible and homosexuality in a second, then isn't it incumbent upon homosexual activists to say why thousands and thousands of years of human history do not apply in essentially the last, maybe say 100 years, 60 years of gay activism? But go ahead.
I do have a question. I'm going to go back.
Okay. But before you do that, let me say that website for the Bible and homosexuality is a guy named Rob Gagnon. It's spelled Gagnon. Rob Gagnon, Gagnon.net. And he's I think he's probably the world's leading Orthodox Christian scholar on the Bible and homosexuality. And for the record, he has a hard time getting gay theologians to debate him. He's very well informed. And if you have a question about the various objections, Jesus never said anything about homosexuality, how do I answer that? That's a terrific website to go to. Yeah, go ahead.
I guess it's kind of a two-part question. The first part is, you said you went to the University of Michigan.
Yeah.
And what did you study?
Political science.
Political science. Okay, and the second part of the question is, you said AIDS is a gay disease.
I said there are homosexual activists who now say HIV is a gay disease.
Okay, so I guess where did it come from, if it's a gay disease?
Well, I think what they're saying, I can't, all I can tell you is, I'm citing factual statistics about the preponderance of homosexual behaviors linked to the people who have HIV. That doesn't believe that everybody, you know, there's not straight people. In fact, there was a case recently of lesbians, woman-on-woman sex and an HIV. It's one of the rare cases.
Well, I mean, when you talk about...
But I mean, I think the answer, I can't, I'm not an AIDS specialist, I don't know where it came from, but the one area in this debate, one of the few areas where we can have agreed upon facts are HIV data. And even though I do believe that it's the CDC is a little politically correct, I mean, for example, calling that a heterosexual transmission, if a woman whose partner engages in bisexual, you know, homosexuality in the down low, and he gives her the HIV virus, I don't think that should be called heterosexual. But I mean, all I'm talking about is the preponderance of facts, and some gay activist groups such as the Los Angeles Gay and Lesbian Center, actually the Billboard campaign where they said HIV is a gay disease, and that's what I cited.
I mean, to say something like that, to bring up AIDS in general and not have a fundamental understanding where you can explain it to everyone in the group so that we can all understand how that's transmitted, because there's a lot to that. You can't just get AIDS by sleeping with someone who has AIDS. You have to have many, many exposures. But I also read in this paper that the tissues are much more absorbent.
Yes.
They are.
Yes.
But it's also harder for a man to contract AIDS from a woman. Much harder than it is for a woman to contract AIDS from a man.
Okay, to go to your point earlier about explaining, I mean, I don't want to get too graphic here, but I heard a talk once from Dr. John Diggs, who was a doctor in Massachusetts, pro-family advocate as well. And he went through and he talked about the membrane and anal sex, and I've got... Okay, this is an old newsletter I did, and in this particular article here, I took quotes out of a book called The Ins and Outs of Gay Sex by a doctor named Dr. Stephen Goldstone, who is also a very strong gay activist. And I guess, cutting to your question, I mean, it's not pleasant to talk about, but for example, one of his quotes is, the